Hello everyone, my name is Preston Dennett and welcome to a new episode of UFOs and the Paranormal. Today's episode I call Truly Incredible, 12 Weird Humanoid Encounters. You know I love talking about humanoid cases. They're endlessly fascinating. I think they have the most to teach us about the UFO phenomenon, and they're just darn interesting. And I've chosen 12 cases for you today, which actually reach back all the way to the 1950s up through the 2020s. So some quite recent cases. Cases coming from all over the world, really from Canada, the United States, South America, including Chile, Argentina, and Brazil, across Europe, such places as Spain, France, Wales, Denmark, and the Netherlands. Also a case from Australia and one case from Russia. Most of these are multiple witness cases, which always brings a new level of credibility to the case. There are a few single witness cases, but many of these also involve physical evidence. A lot of people don't realize this, especially skeptics, but many cases do have really compelling physical evidence, including landing traces, electromagnetic effects, physiological effects as well. So some really compelling physical evidence. But to me, the most fascinating aspects of these humanoid cases are the wide variety of humanoid reports. So people are not only seeing just grays, but short little beings, robotic beings, much taller beings, human-looking extraterrestrials, and just a wide variety of beings that are clearly not from here or wherever they're from. That's certainly open to debate. Now, I do have a lot of cases, 12, that's a little bit more than normal, so let's just get started. And the first case I want to talk about today, I call backyard aliens. A lot of people see UFOs right outside their homes, and that's absolutely true in this case, which took place on December 17, 1956 in Conashaugh, Pennsylvania. This one is a largely single witness case, so there are some corroborating witnesses who apparently saw the same UFO, did not see the humanoids, that the primary witness in this case did see quite close up for a pretty good period of time, and boy are they unusual. This unusual case was researched by Dr. Berthold Schwartz. The main witness is Marie Carow. She was 68 years old at the time of her encounter. And Dr. Schwartz says she seemed to be of above average intelligence and was quick and crisp in her answers to questions, with an excellent reputation for truthfulness. Miss Carow seemed to be a completely truthful person. So, the main witness, Marie, loved watching the deer and other animals that wandered through her backyard, again in Conashaugh, Pennsylvania. Her backyard was bordered by forest. And it was on the evening of December 17, 1956, which turned out to be the last day of hunting season, that she had her encounter. And she was concerned that all the deer had been killed, because she loved watching them. She had a new powerful flashlight, which her husband had recently purchased for her to help with her nature watching. So on the night in question, around 9 p.m., she stepped outside with her flashlight, hoping to see some deer, but instead was shocked to see two very strange-looking, very short men. They stood next to each other, arms at their sides, facing her. One was about 3.5 feet tall, and the other was closer to 3 feet. So she shone her flashlight on and off of them, and they made no reaction. She could see that they were standing right next to the garden stakes by her raspberry bushes, which allowed her to accurately measure their height. She could see that they both wore shiny silver jumpsuits, which reflected the beam from her flashlight. And as she says, it looked like aluminum foil, shiny. They had gloves and shoes. She said they also wore snugly fitting helmets, which left the face visible, though she didn't describe their faces. She did say that they appeared to have fair complexions and were well proportioned and muscular. The taller one was slightly more slender than the shorter one, and she watched them for about 3 minutes. again shining the flashlight on them and off again, but they never reacted, nor did they, as she hoped they would, move away. So she became anxious and excited, and realizing that these were not normal people, she hurried back into the house, closed and locked the door, and ran to her husband in the living room. And she told him, "There are two little men in shiny suits on the back lawn." She said that she didn't know who they were, and would he come out with her and look at them. Now her husband didn't want to stop watching his TV show, and he says he was also somewhat skeptical. So it took Marie herself about 15 minutes to calm down enough to look back outside, but by then they were gone. So she wondered if she had just seen two little spacemen, and speculated that their ship may have landed behind the barn, which was hidden. The next day she did go there and find some crushed vegetation there, but she did admit that it could have been caused by cattle passing through the area. Now, 2 weeks later, she did tell her neighbors and friends who lived a few miles away near Dingman's Ferry, and they said that around the time and date of her encounter, they had both seen a large glowing object speeding in the sky heading west. Overall, the entire event frightened Marie so much that she refused to step outside alone at night for about 6 months following her encounter. There are some very interesting aspects to this case. The fact that these humanoids were so short. I'm not sure that they were robotic. This could be the uniform they were wearing, but really unusual. She did apparently see some landing traces as well. To me, the most telling sign towards the authenticity of this case is the fact that the witness didn't want to go outside alone at night for 6 months following her encounter. This to me argues for its authenticity. And other than that, I mean, the witness does have a reputation for being quite intelligent and honest. It's a super interesting case. And now we move to another interesting case which took place in Spain. And I call this one Humanoids in Pontejos. This is a really interesting multiple witness case. I think it's really interesting where it took place as well, as we shall see. But it did take place on January 9, 1969 in Pontejos, Spain. And there are some really interesting aspects. The primary one to me being that this was witnessed by at least 5 different people. From researcher Manuel Pedrajo, this case definitely qualifies as incredible. It was around 1 a.m. on January 9, 1969. It was an icy cold night, and Felicidad Fernando and her mother, Marin Merino, were preparing food for a few late arriving customers at the cafe/bar that they ran. Now suddenly, the area outside the cafe, across the street, lit up with a brief but brilliant light. Neither of them thought much about it, but now, looking outside the kitchen window, Felicidad saw a strange figure, somewhat up in the air. And she told her mother, "What is that man doing out there?" So both of them, looking more closely, they saw that there was actually a craft of some kind. It was hovering very low, maybe about 10 feet above the ground. So Felicidad and Marin called over another employee, Paquito, and they opened the window to get a better look. Now, about 90 feet away, they saw a rectangular object, all lit up, much like a glowing screen, they said, and hovering in the sky. As they watched, white-orange flashes came from it, filling the area of the cafe at regular intervals. And suddenly, inside the illuminated area, a man appeared. They estimated he was about 6 feet tall, with unusually long arms and an incredibly pale complexion. He looked like he was dressed in a dark gray jumpsuit, and they cried out in shock, which drew the attention of their waiter, Antonio, and he joined them to watch. So now there's 4 witnesses, and as they watched, about 4 other beings appeared, moving around in stiff-like mechanical motions within the confines of this glowing rectangle of light. And they all watched together for about 5 minutes, when Antonio, the waiter, announced that he was going to venture outside, climb a nearby wall, and get a better look. And no sooner did he start to do this, when the object and the figures winked out, quote, like a television set going out. So this really amazed the witnesses, and they continued to watch the area, and suddenly saw a small glowing sphere fall downwards, and then, immediately following this, an immensely large dark object, which they said was mushroom-shaped, or kind of like an upside-down bowl sitting on a plate. This appeared where the glow had been, but slightly more distant. It also lit up the area, illuminating the landscape below it, and instantly this object rose up at very high speed, disappearing from sight in an instant. Now, researcher Manuel Pedrajo learned that a fisherman just over a mile away from the area observed a gray object shaped, like he said, a flying hat. And he watched it stop for a moment, actually near the area where the other witnesses were, and saw it accelerate away at high speed. Now, connected or not to all this, there is apparently a nuclear facility not far from this area, which could be significant. What are these ETs doing, presuming that's what they are? They do certainly appear to be ETs, given that they're flying around in what look like metallic craft with portholes. They're certainly humanoid in form, very much like us, more like us than different. Now, the witnesses in this case didn't get a super good look at what these beings looked like, but certainly appeared to be largely human-looking. What's interesting to me about this case is it's very close to a nuclear facility. That does seem to be a pattern in a lot of these cases. And there's always another one. I mean, you can be skeptical of one case or another, but there's always another to take its place. And to me, that's perhaps the best evidence that there is validity to this phenomena. The fact that there are so many cases occurring over such a long period of time all over the world. Here's another case, which I call rock collecting aliens. Quite a few cases of ETs coming down and collecting soil samples and plant samples, and for that matter, even samples of animals and genetic material from humans as well. This case took place sometime in February of 1969 in a very small town called Nubel. This is in Chile, actually. It's a great case because this does involve multiple witnesses, a landed UFO, humanoids of course, and some very interesting behavior on the part of the humanoids. This case comes from Chilean researcher Elena Marino, and it took place along a beach just south of Valparaiso, Chile. It's a little town called Nubel. It was around 4 a.m. when an anonymous couple who, with their 2 sons, lived along the beach, woke up when a bright light streamed in from outside through the bedroom window. And looking outside, they saw something amazing. A strange craft was descending from the sky in this weird swinging motion. They said it was saucer-shaped with a dome on top, and there were 2 little antennae which emerged from the top of this dome. The craft itself was metallic blue. It glowed very brightly and had several portholes around the circumference. They estimate it was about 18 feet wide, equally tall, and it slowly came in for a landing directly on the beach, less than 200 feet away, resting on 3 landing legs. Suddenly, a bright beam of light shot out of the craft, and coming from the beam were 3 tall humanoids, all dressed in blue. And as one of the witnesses, the husband, says, "Unfortunately, we could not distinguish their facial features. We think they were about 2 meters tall, 6 feet. They were dressed in a sort of combination that covered their entire body. Gloves and shoes formed a whole with the garment, which had a vertical line reminiscent of a closure all along the body. And we saw a kind of metal badge on their chest." So these figures began to walk along the beach.
each of them placing about 10 of what looked like small tubes into the sand. There were many black stones on the beach, small black stones, and the figures began to collect them all. And after taking all the stones in that particular location, they then proceeded to pick up the tubes in the sand, and they all returned back into their craft. This whole experience lasted a good 30 to 40 minutes. And as the husband says, the object rose diagonally, still swinging, then moved rapidly away towards the west on a horizontal plane. They did hear it make a strange swishing noise, and the next day, going to investigate, they found that all the little black stones that had been in that area were now gone. They also saw marks in the sand where the tubes had apparently been inserted into the sand, and this showed that the tubes themselves were about 4 to 9 inches long, varying sizes. And the husband also discovered something interesting. His watch had stopped during the whole time the craft was there, and was now 38 minutes slow. And there were some other very strange effects. The couple noticed that their skin became covered with a, quote, sort of scales, which cleared up after 3 days. So perhaps exposed to some type of radiation? Very hard to say. But they said that they were also emotionally profoundly affected and experienced a lot of fear and feelings of insecurity and nervousness in the days following this encounter.
It's very hard to deny cases like this when you have multiple witnesses looking at this, when there are landing traces, when there are physiological effects as well, all of which are present in this case. I also find it interesting that they're out there collecting stones. Of course, people love collecting rocks here, and it appears that this could very well be a simple scientific expedition to collect some geological samples from our planet. Hard to say for sure, but it's certainly an interesting case of humanoids. And of course, here is another. This one is, wow, so incredible. I call this one Encounter with a UFO Pilot. I love this case because it does have 4 witnesses. It's right over an airport. The UFO came very close to the witnesses, and these witnesses are pilots themselves. So they have a little bit of higher level credibility perhaps than the average witness, given that they are familiar with aircraft and are trained observers, certainly. This case took place on October 5, 1971, in a little airport outside of Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This case is absolutely amazing.
This incredible, and I think important, multiple witness case comes from researcher and scientist Richard Haynes, Ph.D. It was on October 5, 1971, as pilot and flight instructor Jose Americo C. Medeiros, age 23, was in the pilot seat of a Cessna 172 Model I. With him were 3 other men, all student pilots, Celso M., Paulo Cesar G., and Orlando R. They were pilots of varying levels of expertise, and this was a nighttime training exercise. They had taken off from Santos Dumont Airport in Rio and were on a return path very near to the airport at about 1,000 feet altitude when Celso, who was sitting in the right rear seat, noticed a bright star-like object descending and approaching the Cessna. He was shocked and curious, especially when the object reached the same altitude as the plane and very quickly began to pace it. Immediately, all 4 men noticed this object and were deeply impressed by its strangeness, because now it was no longer just a light. They could see it was a structured craft moving along with them at a slightly pitched angle. They said it was white-gray in color, saucer-shaped, totally smooth on its surface, and it had about 3 small portholes around the top section. They could see that the interior of the object was lit up, and they estimate it was about 35 feet long, but really not sure about that. Maybe as small as 10 feet or quite larger, 70 feet long. They did see it had a bright light on the front bottom section. So this UFO began to pace the plane at a distance of about 6,000 feet away. And it did this for a few moments, then made an instantaneous turn, moved directly in front of the plane at a distance they estimate of 100 feet. And as it moved in front of the plane, Jose, again the pilot, could hardly believe his eyes, because in the center porthole he could see the silhouette of an oval-shaped head with dark eyes looking out at them. Now there is an artistic representation of this, which Jose approved after several adjustments. So this representation is pretty accurate according to Jose. And as Jose says, the size of the head was about half the height of the window. My attention was caught by its head, with encephalic bones of large dimensions, and its big oblique eyes. It observed us with tranquility, without curiosity, but with attention. I didn't have much time to look, but the head was larger than that of humans. The being looked at us attentively. So at this point the object moved to the left and below the plane, moved lower, then abruptly made another sharp turn and accelerated off towards nearby Sugarloaf Mountain and moved out of view. So Jose had been about to land the Cessna, but seeing all this occur, quickly radioed the tower with a request to abort his landing and carry about a full 360-degree left-hand turn. This was granted by the tower, and Jose had asked to abort the landing because he and his other student pilots were trying to track where this UFO had gone, but they never did see it again. Jose did call the tower and asked if there was any other traffic in the area and said he had just seen a flying saucer. This excited the tower controller and he began asking, where? But the disc was now gone, so Jose landed. Strangely, none of the men talked about the encounter, though Jose did speak of it to the tower controller. The men never really spoke about it, and for the most part went their own separate ways. Jose later became a captain for VASP Airlines, and he never spoke publicly about his encounter for years, decades, until he retired, at which time he felt it was important to share. Now, at one point, after he talked to researchers, he consented to hypnosis, and under hypnosis recalled seeing what he believed to be a red light flashing from the object, and he saw what he thought might be a sort of infinity symbol on the craft, though he became quite uncertain about the accuracy of this recall, but really didn't recall anything else. So this was pretty much a fully conscious experience. Researcher Richard Haynes was unable to interview the other pilots. Reportedly, one of them, Celso, according to a few of his friends, did see another UFO again later that same evening of the first encounter, though again this was not verified. And none of them, as far as known, experienced any unusual after effects, physically or mentally. So it's pretty much a standard encounter, but a very close-up encounter with pilots seeing a UFO pacing their plane. I like this case because it does have multiple witnesses, all of who are trained observers, pilots. Also, it's so interesting because this is a clear-cut example of a UFO display. It's clear that this UFO wanted to be seen. Why else would it fly directly in front of a plane? So close. I mean, we're talking 100 feet away or so. I mean, that is amazing. I can only imagine what this must have been like for these pilots to see something like that so close. It's such an amazing case. And now we move on to the next case, which I call the aliens at the train station. Sometimes ETs appear in locations that seem very unlikely, and yet it does happen. And that's what happened in this case, which took place actually over a period of 2 days, June 25 to June 26, 1974, in Tandil, Argentina. This one is so interesting because, again, this is a multiple witness case. It took place in a very urban location.
The emotional effects on the witnesses were quite profound. There were apparent landing traces, and not only that, the ETs were back the next day and viewed by another group of witnesses. So this is a pretty extraordinary series of events.
This case involves 2 actual encounters over a period of 2 days. The first one occurring, of course, on June 25, 1974. It was 15 minutes before midnight as 3 men, Pedro Gomez, Braulio Torrado, and Oscar Poli, were at the Tandil radio station in Tandil, Argentina, where they worked as dispatchers. The station closed at midnight, and they were just getting ready to go home, and it was Oscar who first noticed the presence of a humanoid figure in front of the window overlooking the back. Oscar described him as, quote, a being with a fixed gaze, protected by a colored helmet. They did also notice a very bright light. Another one of the witnesses described this being as, quote, a strange being with white skin, a silvery helmet which seemed fastened onto his head, and dark goggles. So they all said that this man was very unusual looking. He had a very pale complexion, a tapered mustache, and a small chin. And he was staring into the station room as if to investigate what was going on in there. And to the men, they said his face seemed to almost glow. They also noticed another weird detail. He had a beard, and it was quivering. So Pedro Gomez noticed it after the first witness, followed by Braulio Torrado. Braulio jumped up to turn off the light in the room so he could see outside better without reflections. And this is when they all saw that the figure had a sort of silvery breastplate that seemed to be emitting or flashing multicolored lights. For a brief second, they thought this might be some kind of joke, but it quickly became clear to them that it wasn't, and this man appeared to be floating in the air. So they turned the lights back on. They saw that this man was now descending slowly to the ground. All 3 men quickly ran outside to investigate, but by the time they reached outside, the man had disappeared. But looking at the ground where he had been, they did find strange circular imprints, which were about a ½ inch deep. Now one of the witnesses, Pedro, was so shaken up by this sighting that he suffered a near nervous breakdown. And that's where this encounter ends. But it's super interesting because the very next day, 2 anonymous men were motorcycling through Tandil near the Tandil Railway office when suddenly their motorcycles were turned and halted by an invisible force, literally throwing them both bodily to the ground. One of them did receive a slight injury to his knee, but they were all right. And getting up, this is when they saw a strange figure about 15 feet away, and described him pretty much exactly the same way that the other witnesses had the previous day. Now these new witnesses had not heard about the previous day's encounter. They looked at the figure for just a few seconds when, quote, it seemed to explode without a sound, and then vanished. And they told nobody about this for a full month, and only came forward after hearing about the encounter which had occurred the previous day. And as it turns out, about 2 months earlier, and about 7 miles outside of this same town, 2 men were driving along the highway when they saw a strange, faceless humanoid standing alongside the road. They thought it was quite strange, and they fled in fear, and shortly later the interior of their car became illuminated by a mysterious, strange light. So yeah, there does appear to be a series of encounters going on in this one area, very close in time.
I keep saying it, UFOs are appearing all over the planet. It's apparent to me that this is much more common than most people realize. This case is interesting because it's your sort of average human-looking extraterrestrial. Not a lot of cases of ETs with beards, but it does appear to be an ET given its uniform and the fact that other people saw it the next day as well, describing it in very much the same way. It's floating around. There is a UFO connection to this directly. So yeah, another fascinating, incredible case. And here's another. This one I call the robot in the forest. And this one is so interesting because talk about a multiple witness case. There's a lot of witnesses in this case. There's a long history of encounters in this one particular area. But this particular incident took place on August 15, 1974, in an area known as Bouchières-aux-Dames, France. This is a little park area, Le Pelouse Park. And yeah, multiple witnesses saw a very strange looking robotic figure.
This next case is quite complicated, involving a series of events over a period of time. But wow, there are a lot of witnesses. And it was around 9:30 p.m. on August 15, 1974, as a group of teenagers and 3 children were sitting on the grass on the grounds of the La Pelouse Park and talking with each other when suddenly a large, white, robotic-looking figure stepped out from behind one of the oak trees. They said it was about 5 feet tall, and boy did it look strange. It had a large, kind of cube-shaped head, no neck, no visible hands, but a very thick body. They said its body was very smooth. There didn't appear to be any facial features to it at all. And it immediately began walking towards the group of witnesses, they said, with a strange mechanical gait. As a group, all of the witnesses rose up in a panic and ran straight to the village to inform the adults. Meanwhile, there was another young couple walking in the area shortly after this, and they also saw the strange figure, and they were heading to exit the park when all the children, the original witnesses, came running back in, this time with adults. So now there were 9 witnesses, and, as if on cue, this figure appeared again. This time it was off at a greater distance. They saw for just a few moments when it disappeared, apparently for good, into the forest. Now no UFO was seen, but the case did eventually make its way to researcher and author Jean-Paul Ronecker, who wrote about it in his book, The Guide to Lorraine of the Strange. Now, apparently, this park has a history of unusual activity, because just 3 years later, on October 12, 1978, 3 witnesses claimed that they saw a glowing white apparition, very much a human-looking form, but floating in the air and zooming towards them at super high speed. 3 days later, 2 witnesses returned to this area, having heard about the previous sighting, and said that they also saw 2 glowing white figures. One of the witnesses tried to chase them in his car. The figures moved too quickly away and disappeared. So news about these 2 sightings grew, and 2 days later, 3 witnesses went to the area hoping for a sighting, and they were rewarded with one. They saw a glowing figure step out from behind a tree and then flee into the forest at high speed. So some of these sound almost ghostly. However, further research into this area uncovered an account of an apparent UFO landing with humanoids dating all the way back to, get this, 1909. A group of witnesses said that they had seen an unknown machine landed in the area with human-looking figures standing around it. Apparently the object did leave landing traces, which were recorded in the local archives. Unfortunately, all of this was destroyed during World War II, so we don't know much more about it.
Now, when you have that many witnesses seeing something, it would be wholly unscientific to dismiss this testimony as a hoax, a hallucination, or a misperception, or any of the other go-tos that debunkers and skeptics often try to use to explain away these encounters. There are too many of them. It's very clear something is happening. I don't know how many cases it will take to bring this into the mainstream and convince all of humanity, but the fact is, this is going on. You can argue about where they're coming from or who they are, but there's definitely something to it. And here is another case. I call this one Landing in Tasmania. This one is super interesting with a somewhat peripheral humanoid connection. Could very well be humanoids, might not be. But it took place in February of 1976 in Kettering, Tasmania, part of Australia. And I like this case because although there is only a single witness and the humanoid connection is somewhat iffy, the landing traces in this case are very interesting.
This next case comes from researcher Keith Roberts, and it involves what appears to be a landing or near landing with possible humanoids in the small town of Kettering. The witness is anonymous, but he says that around 1 a.m. one morning in February of 1976, he looked out the window of his home and saw a strange glowing aircraft of some kind coming down at a 45-degree angle. And he watched it for a few minutes with interest as it went down behind a hill near Little Oyster Cove. Now he assumed this was an aircraft accident of some kind, and it was very close to his house. So he went outside, hiked over to the hill, and looking down, was amazed to see a dome-shaped object sitting on or directly above the ground, only about 75 feet away. He said it had 4 arch-shaped portholes, each of which was emitting a bright yellow-white light. Through one of these windows, he saw a cylindrical-shaped object, sort of like a pole. Through 2 of the other windows, he saw 2 motionless gray shapes, which he thought might be seats or perhaps humanoids. Certainly this is something the researchers brought up, though the witness did not specifically say it. The craft was metallic aluminum in appearance, and around the rim there was this little flat section. And as it rested there, 75 feet away, the witness did hear it emitting a sound like an electrical humming. Now he wasn't thinking UFO. He's thinking this is some sort of secret military government craft. And he watched it for about 6 or 7 minutes when suddenly the electrical humming noise increased and the object took off slowly towards the east, moving upward at a 60-degree angle off into the distance until it was just a tiny dot and it was gone. So yeah, he was not interested in UFOs, had no knowledge of it, and believed that this must be a government craft of some kind. So the next day when it got light, he went down to where the craft had landed or hovered and was amazed to see that there was a circular area of what looked like scorched grass. He says, over time the grass died and was replaced by a, quote, tougher cutting grass. Now it was about a year after the landing that investigators did interview the witness. They went to the scene of the landing and took samples of the soil and grass in this area. They tested it for radiation but did not find any evidence of that. No evidence of high heat in the soil, so that was a little disappointing. However, it was clear that something about the UFO affected the area, as the circle where this craft had hovered was still plainly visible, even 1 year after the sighting.
So there you go, another case that's just super hard to deny. When someone sees something that close for that long a period of time and it leaves landing traces, it's clear something happened. And I find it interesting that the witness himself is still not convinced to this day that that was necessarily extraterrestrial and leans towards this being possibly some secret military craft, which is entirely possible, but it does beg the question, why would a military craft land right in front of a witness in full view? Perhaps they needed to. Perhaps they were in trouble in some way. Very hard to say. I hate to speculate in cases like these. There's really no need to because there's always another case to take its place. For example, this next case, which I call Humanoids in Little Haven. This is a really interesting case which does rest largely on one person's testimony, though there are landing traces and electromagnetic effects, and another peripheral witness. This one took place on April 19, 1977, at a hotel, actually, in Little Haven, Wales. It's really a remarkable case.
Researcher Randall Jones Pugh is the main investigator in this case, which involves a landed UFO and two strange humanoids. The primary witness is Rosa Grenville, a hotelier employed at the Haven Fort Hotel in Little Haven, Wales. And it was around 2 a.m. on April 19, 1977, that Rosa went to bed. And she was reading a book when this weird humming noise continued to distract her. For a while she thought that perhaps she had left the heater on, which can make a humming noise. Strangely, her radio had cut out for no reason that she could explain, but she didn't think much of it. But after hearing this weird humming noise for about 10 minutes, she finally decided to get out of bed to make sure she had turned off the heater. And she had. She realized at this point it wasn't her heater. So she wondered if it might be a nearby ship in the bay, which sometimes do make noise. But looking out the window, she saw something else entirely. There was an eerie, glowing object landed in the field about 360 feet away from her window. Now this light was a very bright blue, was pulsating on and off, and she immediately thought that there might be intruders of some kind trying to break into her cottage or take her chickens, which were very close to this area. So she grabbed a pair of binoculars, and looking through them, she realized she was seeing something she had never seen before. This blue lighted object was actually a large, oval round object about 6 feet wide, and standing next to it were two strange figures. She estimates that they were about 6.5 or 7 feet tall. They had unusually long arms and legs, and she said the figures looked like they were dressed in plastic-looking white boiler suits, which went from head to toe. Strangely, she could not see their faces. And as she says in her own words, they were turning around and observing, but they had no features at all, just a blank face. I couldn't even see a spot. They also had pointed heads. So as she's watching, one of these humanoids climbed up a little grassy hill next to the UFO. At this point, she tried calling out to her husband, who was asleep, but found herself speechless. So finally, she left the window, rushed over to her husband, and shook him awake, literally dragging him out of bed and over to the window. However, when they looked out together, the humanoids in the UFO were gone. So was the odd humming noise. Rosa did notice that her clock also had stopped working. Now, when it got light the next morning, she went out to the field where the UFO had rested on the ground and did see some crushed vegetation in the shape of a sort of crescent. And that was that. But 8 days later, on April 27, she observed a bright light circling the same field. She immediately switched off all the lights in the hotel, got her camera, and waited for the light to reappear, hoping to capture a photograph. Unfortunately, that was it. After this, she contacted researcher Randall Jones Pugh and shared her encounter. And she told him, "I don't know what it is, but I was petrified. If I see it again, I am definitely moving from here." I can't blame the witness for saying that she'd move away if this happened again. This has actually happened to some witnesses where the UFO activity simply became too intense. They moved away from their home. I can think of 3 cases right off the bat. So yeah, this just goes to show that this is a kind of an experience that really affects a person on multiple levels. It can affect you physically, as we have seen, but also mentally and spiritually and emotionally. It's a really profound, superlative experience that can affect a person for the rest of their lives, and often does. And we certainly see that in that case. And now we move on to another case, which I call 3 humanoids in a Saturn-shaped UFO. This is another multiple witness case, quite hard to deny. UFOs flying over the area for some time before they had a very close-up sighting with a UFO with apparent humanoids inside it. This took place on July 14, 1979 in Schiedam, which is located in the Netherlands.
and a really remarkable case because the witnesses got a very close-up view of this craft and humanoids.
There are two witnesses in this case. They're both anonymous. They're known as Mr. B, age 20, and his girlfriend, Miss A, age 18. And it was over the first few weeks of July 1979 that they both had noticed strange and unusual lights in the night sky, but didn't think too much of them. Now, they definitely reconsidered when, on the evening of July 14th, they had an incredible encounter. Miss A did live in a large apartment building which was surrounded by several other buildings in a very urban area of Schiedam, again in the Netherlands, and it was late, around 1 a.m. on July 14th. Her boyfriend, Mr. B, had just left the building and was beginning to walk home, and it was at this point that Miss A, who was on her third-story balcony preparing to wave goodbye to her boyfriend, noticed two round lights, which were flashing on and off at 1-second intervals at a low elevation right in between two buildings. So she called out to her boyfriend to come back, which he did, but by the time he reached the balcony, these two lights, which were orange in color, had moved behind one of the buildings. So they waited to see if they would reappear when suddenly the sky lit up with, quote, a very great and broad flash. And this was followed seconds later by another smaller flash of light. Moments later, a single orange light appeared. It was solid and slightly smaller and farther away, and it too moved behind a building. So these were more strange lights that they had been seeing, just like, the other ones over the past few weeks. And they were talking about this when yet another appeared from behind a building. And this time it was a large, sort of orange-red ball. And as it moved closer, they could see that this was actually not just a light. It was a solid object. It looked like a sort of Saturn-shaped object. And inside, they could see three dark silhouettes. Now, Miss A said that they were standing in sort of a transparent top section. And as she says, they were very slim built. I couldn't see details like their clothing or facial features, but I seem to remember that the figure which was furthest to the right raised his hand. The silhouettes seemed to have their backs turned, and I don't think they saw us. I didn't see any equipment in the sphere itself. Now, her boyfriend's testimony varies slightly. He says that while he did see the silhouettes, he believed they were visible through a large porthole situated around the top dome. And he said the object was a little more oval-shaped than spherical. So these are minor differences, but as Mr. B says, there were also a number of portholes or windows visible through which I could see 3 or 4 dark shadows. These figures moved occasionally, and it was as if they were looking around exploratively. Only their heads and upper bodies were visible, but all I could see was a black silhouette. Now, when speaking with researchers about this, Miss B was very reluctant to mention humanoids, but finally did. And when the researchers asked why she hadn't mentioned them at first, she said that she did not think that they would believe her. They did observe this object with the humanoids for less than a minute until it went behind another building and did not emerge. Investigators did feel that the witnesses were totally sincere. They were a little puzzled by the variation in their testimony, though admittedly 4 years had elapsed since the incident occurred. And in corroboration of their testimony, they did learn that Miss B's mother had viewed some of these odd lights that had been appearing in the week before the humanoid sighting. The researchers were also a little puzzled that they were unable to locate any other witnesses in such a crowded area. I mean, there's 4 or 5 very large buildings here with some nearly 2,000 people living there. So that was a little puzzling to them, but not too surprising when you consider a lot of people don't report this. Either way, The researchers wondered if perhaps the witnesses had mistaken a helicopter for a UFO. Finally, and I think this might be important, both witnesses did report having psychic experiences, such as premonitions of deaths of loved ones, or precognitive dreams that a UFO story would appear in the newspaper the next day, which they did. Ultimately, the researchers of this case labeled the encounter unexplained and wrote, "The Schiedam case is undoubtedly one of the most interesting, well-documented CE3 incidents ever reported from Holland."
So interesting. Once again, we see this weird psychic connection with witnesses reporting a wide variety of paranormal events. It sometimes seems more the rule than the exception. Certainly it is with contactees, but we see it in these close encounter of the third kind as well. So, a really interesting close-up encounter. No, I don't think that they were looking at a helicopter. Most people see helicopters all the time. They would not make that mistake. And besides, helicopters are extremely noisy. And the sound that this craft was making, they described as a low rumbling noise, which is a description I've certainly heard before. And the investigators, again, ultimately concluded that it was a very unusual encounter. Unusual enough that they did write about it. So, here we go to another case. It's funny, the term little green men is somewhat cliche in the UFO field, and yet cases of this do turn up. And that's what I call this case, little green men. This is a sighting which occurred in Neva, Denmark on September 28, 1988. And it's a super fascinating case. Of all the cases in this little collection, this one is probably the least authenticated in terms of there being multiple witnesses and evidence, because no, this is just a single witness who saw a humanoid quite late at night under bad weather conditions. But it was a pretty close encounter, and I like this case because it's such an interesting description of a humanoid. This case comes from researcher Toke Hounstrup and was published in the SUFOI News. There's only one witness who has requested total anonymity, which is understandable considering the nature of her sighting. It was around 11:30 p.m. on September 28, 1988, as she was driving along Gamel Strandvej Road through the town of Neva, and it was a rainy night. And I'll just let the witness describe in her own words what happened. As she says, "I did not drive very fast because of the rain, and suddenly I saw in the headlight from the car two small olive green beings about 50 to 55 centimeters in height, in the gutter's grating where the water ran into. So that's about 21 inches, under 2 feet. And as the witness says, they both gestured with small arms towards each other. The head was almost egg-shaped, but was very pointed towards the chin. I could not see any eyes, nose, or mouth. They were in overalls, which were grooved, similar to plastic, and covered them completely. I was very surprised. Stopped the car, drove a little up in Stationsvej, a side road, to be able to turn the car around. I had to see the phenomenon again. But then I became unexplainably frightened, and I hurried to get on my way and drove quickly home." So she observed them for no longer than 2 or 3 minutes, she says, but during that time did get a good enough look at them to say that they had an overly large head, wide shoulders, very slim hips, and very skinny elbows and knees. She also saw that the feet appeared to be pointed, and the hands looked like they had a single finger and a thumb, or perhaps mittens. While the witness didn't see any UFO, she does believe the tiny figures might have been humanoid extraterrestrials. And the only other explanation researchers could come up with was children in raincoats. Though this doesn't explain their strange clothes, their oversized heads, what they were doing out so late at night, on a very rainy night, how they disappeared, or their really diminutive size, which would be close to a child of less than 4 years old. Very strange. Another incredible case of a humanoid. There's so many of them. And this case is interesting because it did take place in the heart of this little town. No, I don't think that was a child running around in a green jumpsuit in the middle of the night while it's raining. I mean, that makes zero sense whatsoever. And it's kind of funny to me that that is an explanation which the investigators seriously considered. Clearly, the witness does not believe that. It's another interesting case. It's just case after case after case of these humanoids. And now we get to another one, which is super interesting. This one is a multiple witness case. This one does have some apparent physical evidence as well. It involves a series of events, including a UFO sighting and a very close-up sighting of a humanoid. I call this one the alien in the window. And this took place on June 27, 2014 in Holy Cross. This is in La Croix, Quebec, Canada. And I like this case because the witness got a pretty close-up view of this humanoid staring right at him through the back door window. This incredible case of a UFO and humanoids comes from Maxime Boucher, and it involves two witnesses, a mother and son, who experienced a series, really, of weird events culminating in a remarkable encounter with a humanoid. The mother had just returned to her home in Holy Cross late in the evening when she noticed, quote, strange lights in the sky over her home. She wondered briefly if they were planes, but did think that they were strange enough that she tried to look at them through the night vision on her camera, but it didn't really work that well. And looking at the lights and seeing how strange they were, she started to get frightened. And she rushed inside, and as she did so, something very strange happened. There was a loud thumping noise which hit the wall right next to her, but there was nothing there that she could see. So she thought that was strange, and a little unnerved, she decided to go to sleep. It was now 12:30 a.m., and her son, she knew, would be coming home from work at around 2:15 a.m. So she lay in bed, and she says it took her almost an hour to fall asleep because she kept hearing these strange sounds outside her window. And she was dozing in bed when she heard her son arriving home. Meanwhile, her son arrived at home at 2:25. He was creeping quietly into his room, not turning on the lights so as not to wake his mother. And that's when it happened. As the son says in his own words, just steps from the door of my room, I saw from the corner of my eye towards the door leading to the rear a form watching me. I turned my head in that direction for about 3 seconds. I saw a little being about 3 feet tall with a large head and long skinny arms. Its shoulders were wider than the rest of the body. His head pressed the glass door with hands on each side of the head, as if he cut the light coming from each side. In fact, as a thief who looks inside. He watched me. When he saw that I saw, I blinked to make sure I wasn't hallucinating. It disappeared quickly. I was so surprised, and at the same time I panicked. I did not dare go near the door to go outside. My mother woke up about a half hour later, and I told her what I had seen. Now his mother confirms this and says, a little freaked, he said, "You'll never guess what I saw earlier in the rear door window." His eyes were frightened, and he did not want to go. He got scared, and my son is not shy, usually. He said he saw a being about 1 meter high which looked inside. This confirmed my feeling that there was something wrong that I strongly felt a few hours before. He saw the outline given the darkness and the light that came from behind it. So the son continues his testimony. As he says, she immediately turned on the outside light to see if there was something, but there was nothing. I did not sleep all night. We were both scared because my mother told me what she had heard a few hours before. All surrounding noises became suspect. I've never seen that before. Both were really puzzled because their backyard had a locked gate. Nobody should be able to enter or exit.
And the next day, examining the area, they did find some weird evidence. It turned out that a small light, which they had stuck in the soil in the garden, had been mysteriously moved a few feet.
Such a shame the young man in this case didn't wake his mother up right away and call out to her so she could see this too. Though it's apparent that, when something like this happens, people often don't react the way they think they would. It's so shocking that people are often paralyzed by their own fear and don't have the presence of mind to get other witnesses or take a picture or anything like that. More often than not, they run away. But certainly an interesting case, given that the mother herself had such a weird night with UFOs flying over the house, weird noises outside her home. Guessing the ET was there the whole time. I mean, that's pure speculation, but clearly something was going on. The son comes home and he sees it. So yeah, a truly incredible case. And now we move to the last one of this bunch. This case is so interesting because it is really unusual in all of its aspects. I call this one the Aliens by the Cross. It's very recent. It took place on May 3rd, 2022 in a very small village called Kristobolovichi. This is in Belarus, Russia. And it's such an interesting case because this witness got a very close-up view of this landed UFO, which was very unusual in its appearance. Got a very close-up view of these apparent ETs that came out of it, which also had a really unusual appearance. Their behavior was quite unusual. What happened to her as a result of this encounter was also pretty strange. And the location itself, with this UFO landing right next to this cross, a memorial. So all these aspects kind of add up to make this case really incredible.
This next case comes from a researcher by the name of T.V. Volodina. She interviewed the main witness, whose name is Lubov Danilovna Smolskaya. This witness, Lubov, is 88 years old. On the night in question, May 3rd, 2022, she had not been feeling well. She wasn't sleeping well either. It was around 2:18 a.m. when she woke up because a bright light was shining in through the window of her home, located in this very small village. Now she thought it might be lightning at first, but there was no thunder, and she looked out the window and got an incredible shock. And I'll just quote Lubov directly. As she says, "I saw the outlines of some kind of glowing box that stood on the road not far from the roadside cross and looked like a TV. Someone came out of the TV, a certain person who got something. This person had dark or gray skin resembling a strong tan, an elongated rectangular head like a post or haystack. Suddenly a headlight came on at the back of the box, burgundy and mother of pearl. Or perhaps it was the creature that turned on something like a powerful lantern. Then it became clear that in the box sat another creature, also strange but lighter in color, with a head resembling a head of cabbage, and pimples all over the body like a toad. The creature passed something to the other person standing next to it. His hand was very wide compared to a human's. Suddenly, a spotlight began to shine directly through the window." Now Lubov feared that the ETs had realized that she was watching them, and she also began to wonder if perhaps that was the reason for their visit, that they were actually coming for her. So she quickly moved away from the window and was amazed when this weird beam of light seemed to follow her. She quickly rushed over to another window and saw that the beam of light was now gone, and she watched as these two beings got back into this small box-shaped object. And 1 minute later, this object began to float slowly down the road, sending down this weird beam of light. She said that this light was unlike anything she had ever seen before. So this really quite scared her. She ran into bed and hid under the covers and didn't come out until morning. But the next morning, she did go outside to investigate the area where she had seen all this. Again, this was right in front of a cross by her house, a little memorial. And when she went there, she found some odd things. First, she found a small circle of old leaves and withered grass, but she also found this small mound of pebbles. None of this was here before. She wondered if these ETs were responsible for some weird health issues, because following this, she was diagnosed with COVID, but she also recovered abnormally quickly. So she sort of connects that to all of this. She also found it curious that the landing location was so close to the cross, and wondered if that was a factor. Investigators were not able to locate any other witnesses, which wasn't surprising as it was very, very late, and there are very few houses in that area. But they did notice something else. The apricot and willow trees in this area showed apparent damage and withered over the next year.
All right, there you go. Another really incredible case of a humanoid. Can't say I've ever heard of one quite like that. It's interesting that this witness described the light being so unusual that she had difficulty describing it. This is a detail many witnesses talk about, that the lights from these UFOs are different than normal lights in some way. Her physiological reactions are also interesting, given that she suddenly came down with COVID and felt like perhaps this was due to the visitors in some way, who she believes also may have healed her. All that is somewhat unclear in this case, but as you may know, there are many cases of people who claim to have been healed as a result of a UFO encounter, particularly being struck by a beam of light. So that does fit in with these other cases. Another really interesting aspect of this case are the landing traces, the dead leaves where this craft had landed, the fact that it caused the apricot and willow trees to wither. But most unusual for me is that there was this little pile of pebbles or stones in the area where this craft had landed, a pile of stones that apparently wasn't there before this encounter. So yeah, a really interesting case. And there you go. 12 cases from all over the world, reaching back to the 1950s, all the way up to pretty much the present day. And many, many different types of humanoids. Some really compelling evidence. Lots of multiple witness cases. I mean, don't know what it's going to take to get this subject accepted by mainstream scientists. The fact is, skeptics, as a rule, refuse to even examine the evidence. So that has got to change. There clearly is something going on here. It makes perfect sense that these are extraterrestrials. I mean, that's my assessment just based on the totality of all the evidence, given that these craft do have portholes and windows, and humanoids are coming out and they're leaving landing traces on the soil. Many people report being implanted, and some of these implants have been removed and studied. Some people report pregnancies, and then they see the babies, and they even see these babies grown up as adults. I mean, given that these craft have reportedly crashed and been retrieved by our military and are being reverse engineered, I think all of this points towards the extraterrestrial explanation pretty strongly. Again, given that these craft are very much interested in nuclear materials, none of this sounds like something that, say, demons would do, or some spiritual intelligence that might be, completely beyond our own ability to even understand. I suppose anything is possible, and I'm sure there are a lot of different things going on here. But that's why I do this research, so that we can figure out, just lay out the facts, here are the cases, we can make up our own minds and hopefully come to a consensus. So that's it for today. 12 cases of humanoids. I hope you've enjoyed the show. I really appreciate you watching. Thank you so much for coming here each week and tuning in. It's because of you I do these shows, so thank you, thank you, thank you. And until next week, keep searching for the truth. It's out there. Keep asking those hard questions. It's important we do. And most important of all, keep having fun. And I will see you next week. Bye now.